Qatar has called for a return to negotiations and says it remains in contact with all parties as uncertainty surrounds talks between Iran and the United States.
Qatar supports the current condition of the ceasefire, and we are aiming to see a continuation of the ceasefire until there is a diplomatic resolution. It is not in anyone's benefit to return to hostilities. That would, again, put more pressure on the international economy, but also put the peoples of the region, in all the countries in the region, at risk.
There are also mixed signals around talks in Islamabad, with no clear indication of whether negotiations are moving forward. Qatar says it is in a strong position to weather any disruption, but warns that if tensions in the Strait of Hormuz continue, the impact could extend far beyond the region.
Our call has always been for an end to this war that has put all of us at risk here in the region and put international economy and international energy markets in a very dangerous place. And therefore, for us, the call has always been to end this war, get back to the negotiation table.
Qatar says it is pushing to keep the ceasefire in place, but with tensions still high, much will depend on whether diplomatic efforts can hold in the coming days and prevent a return to escalation. Mohammed Alashi, Euronews, Doha.
Like this, it's particularly important.
Norway's Foreign Minister Espen Barth Eide has pushed back on Euronews program Europe Today against criticism from US President Donald Trump over what he described as zero European support in the conflict with Iran. Trump has repeatedly criticized NATO allies for not backing Washington. He raised the issue again during a White House meeting earlier this month with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte.
NATO is a defensive alliance, it's not an attack alliance. However, many NATO countries, including my own Norway, is now dedicated to work on making sure that the Hormuz Strait is open and remains open, not as NATO, but as in the context of a broad coalition of interested parties who are third parties to the conflict, who are not fighting with either side, but who have a shared interest in protecting the principle of freedom of navigation at sea. So NATO countries are doing something, but it's not as party to a conflict.
Eide argued that unlike past interventions such as those in the Balkans during the 1990s, there had been no prior preparation or consensus within the alliance. As a result, there is very limited appetite among member states to join the war. He said that while both the US and Iran may have reasons to end the conflict, the sides are far apart, with negotiations hindered by opposing demands.
As a US delegation heads to Islamabad for a second round of peace talks with Iran, a fragile temporary ceasefire has kept the Middle East on edge. In an interview with Euronews, UK Ambassador to the United Arab Emirates Edward Hobart said that there is a risk of a return to war, while emphasizing the need for a lasting peace with a clear way forward.
I think the risk is there. The risk is reduced while there isn't fighting and while there is a prospect of talking. I don't think it serves anybody for there to be the kind of conflict that we saw previously, which had the impact that it did here in the UAE and in neighbouring countries. So we will be supporting talks to bring peace, but it's got to be the right kind of peace. Living with that threat without it being contained, without a clear way forward, would also be a risky thing for all the countries around here. So that's critical, and getting the global economy flowing again and business able to operate as it was doing before March this year is also a really important objective.
The UK had distanced itself directly from involvement with the US blockade. Why did they take that position initially, and what could or would change that? The UK ambassador to the US, Christian Turner, has told media that the UK was backing the US operations against Iran right from the offset.
Look, the Prime Minister's been very clear that this wasn't the UK's war. Yeah. It wasn't something we wanted to take place. But particularly in defence of the Gulf countries, we have enabled the US to help support that defence through the use of British military bases in the UK and elsewhere. In terms of the Straits of Hormuz, what we want is the law of the sea to be followed, and for these international thoroughfares, which are critical to the global economy, not just to the economy here, not just to the economy in Europe, but actually in particular the economy in the Far East, to be open and flowing. So we don't want blockades, we don't want Iran or others causing danger to merchant shipping in this region.
Tehran and Washington have accused each other of breaching the 2-week truce as uncertainty grows over a push to stop the war from resuming. U.S. President Donald Trump said on Tuesday that he expects the U.S. to be bombing Iran again soon if no progress is made in the second round of negotiations.
Sweden's military intelligence said late Monday that Russia is manipulating financial data to hide the real state of its economy amid its ongoing invasion of Ukraine. According to a statement from Sweden's Military Intelligence and Security Service, MUST, even though official figures showed falling GDP and weak industrial production, Russia was likely plagued by higher inflation and a larger budget deficit than it was communicating. The intelligence service said despite the recent period of high oil prices, which has provided Russia with increased revenues, it will take a price of over $100 per barrel for an entire year to remedy the Russian budget deficit. The intelligence service said the real inflation rate in Russia is closer to the key interest rate of 15% than to the Russian central bank's official estimate of 5.86%. The head of the Swedish intelligence agency said Russia is now living in debt, and Stockholm has recorded financial indications that could point to an impending banking crisis. At a recent government meeting on economic issues, Russian President Vladimir Putin downplayed the statistics, stating they represented, quote, generally expected trends.
NATO intercepted Russian strategic bombers and fighter jets that flew over the Baltic Sea on Monday. French Rafale fighters were deployed from a Lithuanian air base where they are stationed as part of a long NATO effort in place since the 3 Baltic countries, Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia, joined the alliance in 2004.
There's a lot of traffic from the Russian, and there are plenty of times in which, on purpose or not, they are not really respecting the ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization rules regarding flight plans and behavior. So obviously we are forced to take off and just make sure that they are who they say they are, and their intention is peaceful and just transitioning back to their home airfields.
The Lithuanian defense minister stated that last week NATO aircraft had scrambled on 4 occasions to intercept Russian aircraft that had failed to comply with flight regulations by switching off their transponders and flying without a flight plan. Even before the war in Ukraine, NATO was intercepting Russian planes around 300 times each year, mostly over waters around northern Europe. The Russian Defense Ministry declared that the long-range bomber's flight was scheduled and occurred in airspace over the neutral waters of the Baltic Sea.
The European Union is growing optimistic about the imminent lifting of Hungary's contentious veto on a €90 billion loan for Ukraine, ending a political dispute that has severely undermined the bloc's collective decision-making. EU Foreign Chief Kaja Kallas signaled the sentiment as EU foreign ministers met in Luxembourg on Tuesday.
We have a full day ahead, so first we discuss, of course, the war in Ukraine, and we expect some positive decisions tomorrow on the 90 billion loan. Ukraine really needs this loan, and it's also a sign that Russia cannot outlast Ukraine. This is extremely important at this moment.
Outgoing Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has indicated he will remove his veto as soon as Russian oil flows resume through the Druzhba pipeline, which is at the core of the controversy. He recently cited indications from Brussels that flows would return soon. EU officials said on Monday they would seek to get the final green light to release the loan during a meeting of EU diplomats in Brussels on Wednesday. EU Economy Commissioner Valdis Dombrovskis said Brussels expected to start releasing the loan in May or early June, even if it needed to wait for the incoming Hungarian government.
The European Court of Justice has ruled that Hungary's amended child protection law violates EU law and discriminates against gay and transgender people. The court said the legislation stigmatizes and marginalizes non-cisgender people, including transgender people, and noted that the law's title links them with people convicted of pedophilia. According to the court, this association increases stigma and may encourage hostile behavior. It said the amendments seriously interfere with key rights, including protection from discrimination based on sex or sexual orientation, respect for private and family life, and freedom of expression and information. Hungary amended its child protection law in 2021, saying the changes were needed to protect minors from sexual abuse. The law banned the depiction or promotion of homosexuality and gender reassignment. As a result, Hungarian media outlets and publishers were required to remove TV series, films and books that portrayed homosexuality. It is the first time the court has found that an EU member state breached the fundamental values set out in the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. The law was pushed by Viktor Orbán in a referendum coinciding with a general election vote.